No right that you fought for can ever be assumed to stay with you for the rest of your life. You have to protect the rights that you've won.
If I'm going to die, I want to know what it is like to be free.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cheryl Crooks. I'm Executive Director of Cascadia International Women's Film Festival, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here today for another live discussion about our films. This evening, we'll be joined by the director of A Space Needle, The Hidden History, made by BJ Bullert, and also Nia-Amina minor, who appears in the film. We're fortunate enough to have this evening as our interviewer, Linda Chiavaroli, arts writer and the former communications director for the Los Angeles County Arts Commission. I think you're going to enjoy the conversation. But first, I must thank our sponsors, the City of Bellingham, KCTS and Crosscut Magazine, Whatcom County, the Mary Redmond Foundation, People's Bank, and Steve and Eileen Nelson, and all of our other sponsors, without whom this festival would not have been possible. It's not possible also without your support. So before we get into the conversation, let's have a look at the trailer.
The wonderful thing about architecture is that symbolism is deeply part of it. The styles, the influences, and the expressions come from different cultures, different eras. Architecture builds on itself.
The unique shape of the Space Needle has made it retain interest until today. I mean, even though they might think of Starbucks and Microsoft, it's the Space Needle that's really what everyone wants to know about when they come to Seattle.
The Space Needle has this beautiful grace. It is ladylike, it's a ballerina, it's something of substance, and it's of great beauty. And why is that? How did we get that?
Is it a building or is it a piece of sculpture? A building serves a function. A sculpture is just a sculpture. And I think it's a little bit of both. Why does that form combine art and architecture? Well, it was inspired by art in the first place.
Thank you, Cheryl, for that wonderful introduction. I found this film very compelling. It's such an intriguing way that connects architecture and Seattle, and surprisingly dance. We'll get into that. Just to review for people who might not be familiar, the Space Needle was created for the Seattle World's Fair in 1962. And it has become the symbol of Seattle. So BJ, I wanted to know what the impetus was for making this film, which was a labor of love for you, I understand, over a number of years.
Well, actually decades. But I first found out about this connection between art and this icon of the region when I was working on an earlier film, because I had read Victor Steinbruck's Little Story. He's the main architect who put the curve in the needle. And I found out that, well, I don't want to reveal too much because I don't want to spoil it too much, but there was this, I found out that the shape of the Space Needle, it not only intuitively looks feminine, but its historical and creative roots are, okay, and so I'm not going to be doing too much spoiling here, but
Okay,
the
I
idea
got that.
is,
All right.
but I'm happy to imply. What I found out is that the breakthrough shape for that Space Needle was a sculpture called the Feminine One, which was made by a little known artist. And it was made, it kind of reflected this unique kind of dance move. And so the idea that the Space Needle's shape origins go back to a female form. That was definitely not, that's a very tight and direct connection. But when I started digging a little earlier, I was wondering, well, where did that shape come from, and what was in the eye of the architect when he ended up creating the breakthrough design for the needle? And so I started looking at the dancers who were in Seattle at the time that that the architect and the artists were, and I discovered a little story, the story of a very special dancer from Seattle who may have had some inspiration toward the creation of the film, the Space Needle.
Right. I think it's in the film that the thought of of Mr. Steinbruck, is it Victor Steinbruck, who was the main designer,
Mm-hmm.
Was 3 dancers back to back with their legs apart and their arms raised.
Right.
And so, it's Cheryl and I were talking about this, and she said now she'll never look at the Space Needle in the same way again. Because, once you point that out, it does seem, very, very organic in that sense, and you might not
Mm-hmm.
think of a piece of architecture that way necessarily. So the other thing that I really liked, being a dance fan, was that the end of the movie, the end of the documentary, it has a very unusual ending for a documentary, in that it's a combination of choreography, dance, which is performed by Nia, and a poem, and music from a cellist from Seattle. Why did you make that particular choice to end the film? Because it's, in my experience, as I said, unusual for a documentary.
Yeah. Well, mine isn't really a strict documentary, and precisely for some of the reasons that you mentioned. But I realized that in order to convey the sense of the sort of the spirit of the needle, as I came to understand it, you have to go beyond just the visual, because part of what I like to do in film is kind of extricate or extract, draw out the hidden in a story or in a situation. And how can you convey the spirit of, say, a dancer such as Sevilla Fort when there's very few visual artifacts left? And women have often been rendered invisible in architecture.
Right.
And when we look at the city
Yes.
landscape, I never really thought of these buildings as gendered. It didn't even enter my head. But then I realized that if we start seeing this symbol of Seattle as female, and possibly even representative of the spirit of Sevilla Fort, then it changes the way you think about it. Now, I ended up commissioning poetry and dance for this film because I didn't know how to convey this idea using a literal technique, which is what, is kind of the default for documentarians. Only that which can be expressed visually can be communicated. So I had to break out, and fortunately, I commissioned 3 really amazing women poets here in Seattle to take this idea of just imagining the needle as a woman, and then what would she be seeing? And one of the poets that answered the call was Jordan Imani Keith, who is now Seattle's civic poet. And Jordan took this and she wrote this unbelievable poem that again took the story of a woman who had been rendered invisible in our cultural landscape and gave voice to the experience of her and her generation and the actual discrimination that she had to face in life. So we put that together with some music, and then I handed it off to Nia, and Nia created this work of physical dance choreographed art that to me was just utterly breathtaking. Don't you think so?
Yes. Yes, I absolutely do. I absolutely do. So Nia, how did you go about developing the work now the poem is, as I understand it, from the point of view of Sevilla Fort, the dancer. Is that correct?
Yep.
I believe
yes.
so. The poem. Mm-hmm. Sorry, okay. Go ahead, BJ. You were saying.
Oh, yes. The poem, is a reimagining of well, it is Sevilla Fort. It's the spirit of Sevilla Fort embodied in the in the needle. But I didn't quite hear. I think Nia was saying something.
Yeah, I think the development. Yeah, the development of the choreography for this particular piece was really, a call to action from BJ, who brought together wonderful artists in order to respond to and bring forward this hidden history and these hidden connections between the Space Needle and also through the legacy of Sevilla Fort, a dancer who was based here and lived here and was born here in Seattle. And it was through this project that, I knew Sevilla by name, but had not studied her legacy. And it was through this project and discussions with BJ and a really important person who provided just such important counsel and support and encouragement to continue this project, Miss Edna DeGray, who is a dance and health movement educator here in Seattle. It was through her counsel and BJ's counsel and the other artists that are involved, Jordan Imani Keith and Gretchen Yanova with music, that I was able to kind of explore these connections in this kind of poetic way that brought up some unexpected things. I, through studying Sevilla Fort, realized that she had trained and worked with Catherine Dunham and toured with Catherine Dunham. And danced in the Dunham Company. And I grew up and Dunham technique was a part of the training that I had as a young dancer, and drawing on those connections, being an artist in Seattle, and kind of looking at these things that are embedded in probably the roots of a city, but are not often brought to light or talked about enough. And so this really was, like BJ said, a call to kind of explore this history in kind of this, nonlinear, poetic way, using your craft to bring up these complexities that would be, sort of difficult to talk about in other forms, And I think that through dance, I was able to create a piece that really spoke to Sevilla's legacy and also the legacy of the Space Needle, but also responded very much to Jordan's words and Gretchen's music, and that was this sort of symbiotic kind of creation that I was able to dive into with the ending piece that you will see at the end of the film.
Yes. Well, some people might have watched it already, actually, because it's available, since yesterday, I believe. So some people have seen it, but if you haven't seen it, certainly watch it because it's really terrific. Now, we've talked about the influence of the feminine, and Sevilla Fort apparently was a very strong, certainly comes through in the poetry and the dance that you created, Nia. I don't know. Do you want to not give away too much, BJ? But I think that
actually,
she was
now
such
that
a strong
you
figure.
reminded me that. Now that you reminded me that this is an online festival and people can watch the movie whenever they want. I mean, I got to pull the spoiler alert,
Right.
So
of
it's
course.
fine. Yeah. So what was the question?
The question was, Sevilla Fort was obviously a very strong woman who ran into a lot of, not only because she was a woman, but because she was also African American, who ran into a lot of hurdles in her life, and seemingly managed to find a way over them or around them. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about her, because we're talking about the feminine in architecture, and we're also talking about the empowerment of women.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, do you want to?
She wanted to be a ballerina.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can say a little bit, and then I know you'll have something to add to this. But Sevilla Fort, she came of age at a time when there was so much widespread discrimination. She couldn't get into any ballet schools. She was turned away everywhere. She wanted to be a ballerina, and she couldn't. Fortunately, her mother worked for Nellie Cornish, who ran this Cornish art school, which was this gathering place for artists, architects, all kinds of creatives, including like Merce Cunningham and lots of amazing. John Cage was there. In fact, John Cage actually created a piece of music for Sevilla Fort when she was a student at Cornish. But the thing
we're talking
is,
about the 1930s here. Yeah.
We're talking about the 1930s.
We're talking about the 1930s.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to throw that in.
That's important. Yeah. But the lifespan of Sevilla covered this period where certainly in terms of the civil rights movement, people of color started coming in to their own, and there were lots of good allies, and there's terrible discrimination and continues to exist, obviously, but she was just a guiding light, and she synthesized a sort of modern and Afro-Cuban, Afro-Caribbean dance, and actually Nia could talk more about that. But she gave us a real gift, and again, she was one of these people that's been invisible in Seattle history. And so part of the agenda of the film, obviously, is to bring that history of light, as well as the discrimination and the struggles that she had. But she persevered, just like the Space Needle. She persevered. She created a life for herself. She went on to influence generations of dancers. Alvin Ailey, actors such as Marlon Brando took classes with her. It's like she didn't give up. And that's something that I'm incredibly proud of, to be able to honor that. And Nia, in her dance was just brought some of these, body movements to light that to me are just so breathtaking.
Right.
A lot of Sevilla's history is not written down. And in that way, it's not accessible for everyone. Which is something that came up a lot in the making, in the research for making this piece. And it was mainly through conversations with Miss Edna conversations with BJ, conversations with other creatives and artists based in Seattle who knew about her, knew about her history and were able to speak about her, that I was able to kind of gather more information about who she was and what her legacy was. And then also tracing her history through Black Modern Dance with Kathleen Dunham Company, and on to New York, where she was able to open her own studio and school and teach pretty well-known individuals that were, in the theater world and in the commercial world and film and television, and teach them and kind of leave this legacy as an educator also. And I think that's an important part about this, is that the kind of complexity of the oral history, and how it has to maintain, and it is through telling these stories that the history continues, and saying her name and researching her name and talking about her to other people, and even having this panel discussion where she comes up even amidst something that, seems disconnected for a lot of people who have no idea about these connections. And, it was really important that in the piece that I was exploring those hidden histories, exploring the body and what it can carry, the histories it can carry. And I think that I was really appreciative of being a part of this process. One moment that was extremely spectacular was when we were able to, as a creative team, have a screening at the Seattle Library. And BJ can speak a little bit about this, but her brother was able to attend with his family.
Sevilla's brother,
and
yes.
also Sevilla's brother was able to attend with his family. Right. Yeah. And engage in a discussion with Miss Edna DeGray, who has been a champion of her history over the years, and wanting to get her story told and wanting to show these connections and the importance for a place like Seattle to honor those histories. And so that event was spectacular. I don't know, BJ, you want to talk a little bit how it came into fruition?
Well, I'm just so happy that you mentioned it. Yes, the Seattle Public Library put on a whole evening around the Space Needle, and it had an art exhibit, but it was also an opportunity to daylight the story of Sevilla Ford. And her little brother, John Ford, came, who he was in a wheelchair, his family came, and it provided this opportunity for Edna and John to sit and have a conversation. And actually, I can make that video available to anybody who's interested, who'd like to hear about what it was really like for someone to be Sevilla's little brother and to grow up in Seattle at that time. And you see, the thing is about history and film is I like to make it as tangible as you can. And when you have that direct connection to a member of a family, or to somebody who is, who knew Sevilla, who was part of that scene, it helps bring it to life. And so the stories of discrimination and creative challenge all become a little bit more anchored in a discernible reality. So, I have to give a shout out to the Seattle Public Library for providing a space for Edna DeGray and Nia-Amina and Jordan and all the people who helped make that film possible come together and have a lively conversation. But the thing that I like so much about documentary film is that it provides us opportunity to create memories and to kind of shift the kaleidoscope of how people see their world around them. And for me, to be able to kind of reframe the Space Needle, this icon of the Pacific Northwest, one of the most memorable towers and the most recognizable towers in the world after the Eiffel Tower. Perhaps there may be one or two others, but it's a symbol of the Pacific Northwest. And to imagine that symbol of the Northwest to not just be women holding up, a saucer, but to possibly capture the spirit of someone who was creative, strong, innovative, dynamic, and kind, like Sevilla Ford, who kept, she just kept dancing. And there was this scene in the film where you can see James Baldwin and Harry Belafonte talking about her. that was done a few days, a month or so before she died. I mean, there was this vibrant dance community in New York that it was that welcomed her, and she was integral as being a part of it in terms of sharing her dance talent and her spirit. You know, I really think that you know, this, if you think of the Space Needle as representing the spirit of Sevilla Ford, I associate it with being kind, with being welcoming, with having perseverance and overcoming adversity, and just continuing to keep on going despite the obstacles that are thrown in your way. And to me, that's kind of the story of the Space Needle. And that's a story of women. You know, how many times do we get knocked down and we have to keep on going, or we choose to keep on going? We can always give up, you know, but there's a sense of empowerment and of strength that I see women, you know, having as they move through life, through the phases of, you know, youth to various kinds of coupling to, you know, coming out the other end. You know, in many ways, to survive is to succeed. And I think the Space Needle has this wonderful symbolic power of being a constant in our cityscape, but also something that is a symbol of women's empowerment and of strength and of perseverance and of possibly even the gaze of a Sevilla Ford.
Yes, exactly. I also want to note that the feminine one sculpture that the architect had in his office was recreated by a later artist and now exists by the Space Needle. And you can actually go see it and enjoy the form and have the, what do I want to say, the similarity between the two right there visually in front of you. We also had a question that I guess came in near the beginning, so maybe this person knows the answer. Would like to know if the dance performed in the film was a piece of Ford's. No, it wasn't. It was created by Nia-Amina. But I don't know that there was that much survives of her work in terms of video or whatever. Nia, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, there isn't much in terms of record and archive, and from the archive there aren't any video sources, pictures, written kind of explanations of her life, brief summaries of, you know, her experiences in New York and her experiences touring with the Katherine Dunham Company. I learned that she was in the film Stormy Weather because Katherine Dunham's whole troupe was in that film in this particular section of that film.
That's right. Yeah.
So there are things, and I think, you know, you have to, more research needs to be done, and it provided a sense of, there are these gaps in time that I had to kind of fill or imagine how they might have been filled, what they might have looked like, what it might have felt like, what it might have, what colors, you know, the movement, you know, words. And I think that by bringing together a poet, you know, a musician and a dancer, you're able to fill in those gaps in a creatively poetic way that doesn't necessarily need to be based in literal fact, because those archives don't exist right now. And so the artist, and this was my call to myself, was to, how do you use this material? How do you get a glimpse into her legacy and her history when there isn't that much there for you to work with? And I think that what was really special were the relationships that were created as a result of this project that will continue those conversations and continue to fill in those gaps. I mean, we talked about the Seattle Library being a very special one. This coming together and talking about it once again, and just kind of making sure that the documentary lives on, the dance lives on, and so does Sevilla Ford's legacy, and how do those look in the near future?
That's right.
There actually is There is another
I found-
question here that actually relates to what we've just were talking about. It's, did Fort know Alvin Ailey or dance with him ever?
It's my understanding that he actually studied with her for a while in New York. That's my understanding. And there was another film, by the way. There was a short film called They Danced to Her Drum. It was a student film that was made when Sevilla was, you know, in the last year or so of her life. So she's very, very frail. So you don't really see a lot of it. But yeah, I should probably double check and fact check it. But I believe Alvin Ailey took classes from her.
I
So did
believe
Marlon
I
Brando.
found that in some of the online material that I found too. Now, she didn't dance with his company, but yes,
No,
there
oh,
was
no,
a
no,
teacher
no,
relationship
no.
there. Yeah.
No, she had her
And
own
what about
school.
Martha? Right, right.
Well,
What
Martha
about Martha
Graham
Graham?
No, she
Go
didn't
ahead.
dance with Martha Graham, but Martha Graham came to Cornish, and so the time that Martha Graham was visiting Cornish, Sevilla was a student there, so there's a connection in that way.
Yes, right, right. Very good. One last thing. You said something about Nia. You said something. The dance, that you went deeper into the connection between African movement and modern dance, which of course is you know, something that Catherine Dunham did and very much. And could you elaborate on that a bit?
Do you
That it
mind just
kind of
saying that question
deepens
one more
your-
time? I think I
I'm
missed the
sorry.
beginning.
Oh, okay. You were saying that in creating the dance, that you went deeper into the African dance, modern dance connection that had been part of your training and part of your dance history. And I wondered if you wanted to elaborate on that a bit.
Oh, definitely. Yes, I mean, I grew up dancing at the Debbie Allen Dance Academy, and there we learned a lot of different forms of dance, and what was really impressed upon us was the importance and the value that each one of them had, that there wasn't one that was more valuable than another, but that we needed to be knowledgeable artists about those forms in order to have our work be informed in the future if we were going to continue to pursue a career in any sort of professional way in the arts, that these forms needed to have value and importance to us, and we needed to be knowledgeable about them. And one of them that was really was the first time that I had heard about this technique was Dunham technique. And I think I joined when I was about 10 years old and left when I was 18 in high school. And throughout that time, I was, studying the Western Triumvirate, ballet, modern, jazz. I was doing tap. I was doing many different forms. And one of them that remained consistent was Dunham as well. And that really gave me an opportunity as a younger dancer to dive into a sense of history and connection from the concert dance world into Black modern dance and into the African diaspora. So that was a history that is a history that I carry with me in my work, and that it was something that I was able to tap into. That was a connection that just happened, that I happened to share with Sevilla, that I don't know if it would have been this way had I not trained the way I trained when I was younger, or had I not met BJ, had I not met Miss Edna, who also trained in those styles as well and those disciplines as well. And that we had this connection, not just in terms of the form and the structure, but also in terms of the people and the legacies of the people that continue to teach that work. So that was something that I was able to draw from immediately. Which provided a lot of context about, maybe the way that Sevilla may have been moving her body once she left Cornish and joined the Dunham Company, getting a sense of the history of the movement that she would have been doing with the Dunham Company, and knowing that history because I was training as a young dancer in a similar way. And that is another person whose legacy is so important, Catherine Dunham, and her influence on concert dance, her influence on ballet, her influence on modern, her influence on jazz, on commercials and movie musicals. And so, you know, it was important that I thread these histories and these legacies together, kind of suture them together in, you know, in a film in a space that it didn't seem like there was a place for it, right? That we were bringing these stories in and we were going to create the connection and show the value and importance, but maybe other folks would not notice it otherwise. And so I think that was really a special opportunity. And then here in Seattle, I work with Spectrum Dance Theater under the direction of Donald Byrd, another person who, you know, is a dancer and a choreographer who was in New York, and who, when I said Sevilla's name, immediately Donald Byrd was like, "Oh yes, I know Sevilla. Do you know this? Have you heard this music? Have you heard the bacchanal that wrote for?" And you know, I mentioned before that many of these histories, especially in the dance world, really are oral histories. They're histories that are passed from teacher to student, from dancer to dancer in a company, from choreographer to dancer. And so often, you know, they're not written, which does not make them less valuable. The value is in that storytelling. And here we are in the form of documentary film, doing the same thing, telling those stories, passing them from person to person, community to community, especially at a time now when we're apart, you know, being involved in a film festival like this, stories get to continue to be shared, you know, is so important.
One quick last question that came in. What other structures in Seattle exemplify the feminine figure, if any? Are there any other structures that were inspired by the feminine figure? I guess this is a question for BJ because you've lived in Seattle your whole life.
Yeah, well, no, just good. Born, but I did go away and came back. No, I can't think of anything in particular. There's one building downtown that I understand some of the design was inspired by I think a Greta Garbo figure, but I don't remember the name of it. But it has a lot of diagonal lines, and if the light catches it in just the right way, it may be like you can view it from West Seattle. But nothing outside of that. You see, most of the traditional architectural structures have straight sides, you know, and they're like big boxes, you know. But I just want to tag on something Nia said, is how critically important it is to capture these oral histories that make history alive by getting the stories of teachers passing on to students, and students passing on to their students and to the public. We got to get this story going, Nia. We got to start interviewing Donald Byrd, and we need to go something with it. Go somewhere. We talked about maybe making a film on Sevilla.
Right. Well, obviously the conversation continues. We just got a good review here on the chat stream of a great conversation. So I think it's time maybe for the great conversation to wrap up. And obviously this is a project that's going to continue in various ways. Thank you, BJ, and thank you, Nia.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you.